And there we go. All right. I think this will kick off my first session as host for the Danish Power BI user group. And I'm happy to welcome Matthias. And looking into your career and history and technology stack background, I found that we were quite similar, actually. So I started out coding as well.
Mm-hmm.
I made the jump into BI a little earlier than you. So my coding background are no match for your skills. I have browsed through the GitHub repo, and it's amazing what you've accomplished in there. So I'm very much looking forward to seeing what you have to tell on these PBI tools in the next coming hour. And we're obviously here to see the advanced Git branching model for Power BI. It's something you have been working on for quite some time, and also lately been giving talks about in various user groups and other streaming events. And if you would indulge me in introducing yourself, and then we will head on into the content and the meat that I think we're all waiting for. Thank you for joining us.
Absolute pleasure, and thanks very much for inviting me, Jens, and for the very kind introduction. Hopefully I can live up to the high expectations you set here. Let me share my screen to start with, and then hopefully this is the correct one. Got a slide here with a few bits about myself. As you rightly said, I started off in software as a software engineer and architect. Always more or less exclusively worked in the Microsoft space, and found myself moving into Microsoft BI some 6-7 years ago. And originally I was a one-man band, pretty much setting up a BI system at YouGov, the company I work for. A couple of years later, I then started building a team, and that gets us straight into the topic of today, because that pretty much kicked off a lot of questions and a lot of issues to be resolved from a technology and management point alone. So you mentioned my work on PBI tools. That's a Power BI source control open source tool, which was pretty much triggered for that very reason, right? So when I found myself trying to scale Power BI projects, particularly having come from a software background where source control is a complete normal thing, I realized, well, we don't have anything like that in Power BI, and it makes scaling and collaborating and working on projects in a team context really complicated. So that's pretty much where I started off.
One thing,
with, yeah.
I just want to make sure that you're showing showing the presenter view and not the actual slide.
Oh, am I? Okay, yeah, very good point. Let me double check.
Thank you, Fernando, for
this one. Here we go. Thanks very much. Yeah, should have seen that.
Yes.
Cool. Thanks very much. All right. So let me just move on here, getting into today's topic. Basically, PBI tools for Power BI source control came out of that very need. You know, how does this all work in a team context? But source control is not the only thing here. There are lots of questions in terms of, well, how are we actually organizing work? How do we practically manage to collaborate? And that's what I want to talk about today, basically. Source control being one of the ingredients here, but ultimately I want to present a development model that I've sort of arrived at after many iterations and quite a few years of trying out what works best. Yeah, very keen to sort of share that with a wider audience and hopefully also trigger some conversations because, you know, it's all about continuous improvement. So let me give a brief introduction in terms of the Git branching model I want to talk about, and then show what's needed in terms of setup. I'm very keen for people to be able to have some takeaways here and replicate the setup on their own if they want to. And beyond that, there are a bunch of demos which I've prepared. In terms of slides, that's pretty much it, because I made a big effort to actually invest into proper documentation on the PBI Tools website. You know, that's been one of the downsides previously. I haven't been able to invest too much there. And so all the contents and lots more details of what I'm presenting is actually live on the PBI Tools website as of earlier today. And that's the URL which you might want to bookmark to get there. So I'm going to jump out of the PowerPoint and switch over here. So here we go. This is so this is the landing page where I'm introducing the branching model and all the background behind it. So let me start off with objectives. What are we actually trying to achieve here? I put down 6 different points. So first of all, and it's really important, right? I really want to make sure that this doesn't end up being too technology focused here. At the end of the day, what we're talking about is about business value. It's about shipping value to the business. Obviously, it's always extremely exciting geeking out about technology among technologists, but particularly in the position I'm in right now, where I'm actually a team manager more so than an engineer, it's very important to stress that point. So how can we continuously ship business value in a high quality and reliable way, right? So that was one of the key questions here. And so the release model, which we'll talk about in a second, is my answer to it. Secondly, very important, production should always be sacred, as in an ideal world, no one has direct production access, and what goes into production, what changes in production is actually guarded and system driven. Thirdly, I also already mentioned scalability earlier. In an enterprise context, we need to be able to develop projects in parallel. We need to be able to scale by adding more people to a project without them stepping on each other's toes, and making sure that this actually works well. Deployments should be automated. Why? Well, if anything, if you automate stuff, you remove risk, you remove arbitrary things that can happen from you doing things manually. Ultimately, you get much more reliability here. Also, again, this is where I've got my manager hat on. Organizational knowledge, right? All the conversations that actually go on whilst working on a project, all the questions and answers that come up, all the decisions that are being made, that's all really important material. And so I want to be able to hold it all in one system rather than the stuff being scattered across emails or just being talked about, with no documentation. And so what we're about to see, we're basically using a DevOps project that integrates what we're planning to do, what the specs are for that, and how we're implementing that is an ideal solution here. And then also quick feedback, right? Developers need to be able to actually see very quickly, if not immediately, what any of their changes look like in a production-like environment, right? If we had a system that prevented anyone from actually getting quick feedback, where we had artificial delays, it would certainly be very problematic. So I'm claiming that I've achieved all of those objectives here. So let's look at this one by one. First of all, let me start with a little visual. So this is, can I fit it on one screen? Yes, I can actually, very good. So this is a high-level diagram of the model I want to present here. So first of all, I'm assuming everyone on the call has some basic background with regard to Git and source control, right? So I'm not going to start all the way from zero here. So if we're looking at the different branches we've got in place here, as an example, I put 3 branches here, with main branch always representing what's currently in production. And vice versa, right? So what's in production should be in the main branch, what's in the main branch should be in production, by definition. We then have a release branch in place, which is ultimately originally created of the latest version in main. And that's where incrementally all changes that ultimately go into a release are being integrated. So that becomes our integration branch. This is where we literally have continuous integration in the sense that features signed off go into that branch, and I continuously see what's already in place on the way to a complete release. And then ultimately, the actual work happens on feature branches, which is a very common concept and term when it comes to Git. So feature branches are basically owned by individual developers. They relate to one particular feature or issue or bug we want to work on. And key here is the focus, right? Key here is that we're implementing one change rather than a whole range of changes, which allows us to be very quick, actually, in going through our backlog and in adding signed-off changes into our integration branch. So the dots here basically represent changes on those branches, basically commits, and the dots are color-coded, representing different environments. So let's talk about environments for a second. I've got those down here, blue, green, yellow, and gray. distinguishing between dev, staging, and production is very, very common. That's an established model for different environments. Dev basically being where anything goes, right? Where developers have full access and where things can be tested out. Staging is where we effectively have a preview where we have changes which have already been signed off but aren't in production yet, or you could also call it pre-production, if you will. And then production, obviously, is what end users are engaging with. So the model I want to present here basically says that first of all, I'm defining the scope of a particular change that's meant to go into production. We call that a release, right? So the example here is we've got release 1.0 in production at the moment. We now, as a team, set out to work on release 1.1. Doing that in a predictable and structured way means that whoever's in charge of the release, you know, your project lead, your release manager, your product owner, whatever you want to call them, basically determines what's the scope for the release, what are the issues we need to work on. We also then kick off work on the new release by actually creating that release branch. At this point here, it has no changes with respect to what was in 1.0, right? But that will change. Then individual issues are assigned to developers. Each one of them creates a feature branch of the current release branch. So this is one example here. This is feature one. What we do in my team, we always put developer initials as suffixes in there, because once again, feature branches are basically owned by an individual, and that way we can see just by looking at the name who actually owns it. You know, it's crystal clear. Initially, this is the gray color. All development obviously happens locally, right? Just on the developer machine. When the developer is ready, or with respect to they think they've done everything, or they want to have some feedback, they create a pull request, and so this is key here. The pull request basically is which then allows us to start collaboration. This is where, first of all, some automated deployments kick off. Secondly, review is happening, right? All current DevOps systems, GitHub, Azure DevOps, GitLab, Bitbucket, whatever they're called, they all have a very rich support for collaboration or conversations and reviews with respect to pull requests, and that's a model that I find very useful, and we're actually using extensively now in my team. This is basically where a particular change leaves the developer machine and goes back sort of into the team context, if you will. And to facilitate that, and you see the change of color here, the model will automatically trigger a deployment into the dev environment when a pull request is created. So, you know, coming back to the quick feedback point I made earlier, that's really key here. So as developer AB in this case, I'm basically saying I'm done with my work on issue 1. I'm creating a pull request. I then automatically get to see my changes in the dev environment. So I can actually have another look there. How do things behave, you know, in a real environment as opposed to just my local machine? Then the project lead will come in and start reviewing things. And it may well be the case, and I put that in here as well, that as part of that review, additional changes are necessary. I mean, in my own experience, almost always, right? It's I would be hard pressed to think of a case where something actually made it through straight away. And again, this is where deployment automation comes in as well. Any subsequent further change committed by the developer into their feature branch will trigger another deployment into dev. Again, giving quick feedback, allowing both the developer as well as the project lead to actually see what's the impact of the change, how does it work in a real Power BI workspace. Ultimately, once the pull request is signed off and everything is fine and we're happy, the pull request is closed, which then automatically merges things into our integration branch, our release branch. And again, that triggers another automated deployment. This time, however, into the UAT environment as opposed to the dev environment. Obviously, this is a very simplistic model here where we're basically just looking at one issue. In practice, there would be any number of issues, and they would basically all get committed into the integration branch so that ultimately we've completed all work needed, and we are then actually able to do a final merge, which would wrap up the entire 1.1 release in that example, merge it into main, which then automatically makes it production by basically triggering a production deployment. That's also helped by the system in that we would create a tag to mark one very specific commit to actually be the source control counterpart for the release that's currently in production. So that's the idea, sort of explained on a high level. Before I go into like through further slides or so, let me just show what this looks like for real, right? In GitHub in this example. Now, let me check one thing, because before I came online, I noticed that some of the things I was trying weren't working. And in fact, yeah, so very unfortunately, there seems to be an ongoing issue with GitHub Actions. So we may well not get the full experience here, but fortunately, it's not my fault. And nonetheless, I can work around that. So first of all, I've got a public repository here, which everyone is free to check out and have a look at. That's a Power BI dataset set up with exactly the model we've looked at. So let me walk you through here. So first of all, source control, which I mentioned before. This is PBI tools doing its work. We're basically extracting the inner contents of a PBIX file, in this case, one that defines a local model, and split it all out into individual folders and files, allowing us to actually see changes very nicely. So looking here as an example, we can see that every table in my model is represented by a subfolder. If I go into sales, for example, I can see I've got columns and measures, again, as subfolders here. If I then go in here, I can see sales amount as an example. And I actually get to the DAX formula for that particular measure very, very nicely. If you're familiar with Tabular Editor, with the save to folder format has a very similar concept. It is slightly different. So for instance, Tabular Editor wouldn't be able to extract the DAX formula in this way. Tabular Editor extracts it embedded into a JSON definition, which is from a source control point of view problematic because you've got escape characters and things like that. But you know, the principle is exactly the same. And I think I will, because I've had a lot of demand for this already, I will actually enable PBR tools to support Tabular Editor's exact extraction format, just so that you can use the deployment tooling without actually having to change your source control format. So we've got that. We've got the data set in here. We have 3 branches in place, and obviously that should look familiar, right? There's a main branch, there's a release branch, and then there's an issue branch. We can see they all have different statuses in terms of how many changes they've got. We also have environments. So if I click here, I can see 15 minutes ago, we had a successful deployment into production. And an hour ago, we had a deployment into development. That's the thing which didn't quite work earlier because of the GitHub outage, but it looks like it's caught up now. So we can see that. Going into the Actions tab, we can see there are actually almost 3,000 workflow runs. So this is a project which I've put in place a month ago or so, and I've basically put it on a timer. So this is a very intense recurring test of Power BI deployments. And we can also see that our 3 environments we talked about earlier are basically also represented by individual workflows: development, UAT, production. So we've got that. Looking at, I just need to find the correct window. So if we now go into Power BI, datasets, dev as an example, I've got a data set here, and if I look at this, I can see where it's come from. So this is one particular feature which is extremely handy. Basically, the deployment system, here we go. So the deployment system driven by PBR tools will automatically inject metadata, which we only know at the time of deployment. So even though I'm in Power BI now and I'm looking at the data set that could have come from anywhere, looking at this particular info table, which again is a sort of a convention we've come up with, I can see precisely where that's come from. I can see what's the version. I can see what's the environment. I can see even what's the branch it was deployed from. And if I take this run ID here and copy that, and then go back into GitHub, I will basically be able to see precisely what was the CI/CD run that triggered that particular dataset deployment. So we can see this one ran 14 days ago. It took 42 seconds in total. If I go here, I can see the output from PBI tools deploy, giving me a view at the dataset ID, the URL for it, when it was created, and also I can see here, let me just make this a little bigger, where metadata values were actually injected into the dataset at the time of deployment, right? So here as an example, the version number, that's not hard-coded in my dataset because obviously that changes. And I don't want developers having to sync version numbers. This is maintained centrally as part of the repo itself. This is the GitHub commit char, the run ID we've just looked at. The environment is injected as well as the branch. So those are, apart from the version number, those are all values which basically come from environment variables in our DevOps system. And that means I can, I've got full confidence, first of all, with respect to anything I'm looking at in my Power BI tenant. I can always know exactly where it's come from. Knowing this run ID as an example also means that I know precisely which particular commit this came from. So as you can see here, right? If I click on that one, I can see this commit was done 26 days ago, and I can see precisely what's actually changed. Those are all report changes where basically one page was added, as well as one visual. And again, you know, as a project lead, as anyone who's in charge of reviewing things or checking what's changed, I've got full visibility here. All right. Do we have any questions at this point?
Yes, we do. So okay. There was a question on GitHub account types. This is Fernando, who is asking about when then you will open a corporate GitHub account instead of a personal one.
When I would do that, or
yes.
Well, basically, whenever I've got sort of sensitive projects that I don't want to give to the public, right? I mean, obviously, I'm showing a public repo here just so that everyone else can see it. But obviously, if that were a real world project, it would definitely not be public at all. And as a company, you would definitely want to create a GitHub organization as opposed to just using a personal account, because that gives you additional sort of management features, right? You can create teams, you can assign permissions to teams. None of that works on a personal repo. However, it's then also chargeable, right? So public repos you pretty much get for free. Once you go into organizational repos, which you want to keep private, you have to pay GitHub. But I mean, that's fair enough, right? That makes a lot of sense.
So by definition, a personal GitHub account cannot be personal or private?
Oh, no, absolutely. Okay. Yes. Yeah. I mean, yeah, the point was, what I was trying to make was, as an organization, you probably want to get all the GitHub organizational features, yes. You know, yeah.
Okay, another question, if we might. So this is on how, and I'm assuming you will demonstrate this, how do I get a report into a folder in GitHub? Mm-hmm. Yes,
yep.
So we'll come around to that.
Mm-hmm. Good. That's it?
Let's continue.
Okay, fantastic, thanks. Cool. So so just for your reference, right? So what I explained earlier is also all spelled out here, basically in 10 steps in terms of the various aspects of that model. I'm not going to read that out to you now. I put this table in here where I'm highlighting what are the key ingredients of the model, right? So obviously you've got to have a Git repository because that's what everything else revolves around. We got to have an issue tracker. First of all, so that we can define what's the scope for a particular release to start with. And secondly, so we can actually track the various feature branches and changes against individual issues, right? Getting this full connectivity. Release milestone already talked about, that sets the scope. Version releases, it's probably worth spending a minute on that because in a way this is probably the most unusual aspect of the model. And again, I would think that to some degree this is here due to my sort of history and background in software development, right? So if you think about software, it's very natural to us that we think about versions, right? So the latest Power BI desktop version, for instance, is 2.106, which is the June release. Looking into Visual Studio Code, the latest version is 1.68, right? So with software, it's totally normal that we actually put those labels on particular releases. And I'm proposing that we can do the same thing for Power BI artifacts, specifically Power BI datasets and reports. With Power BI datasets, we've already seen in a quick demo right now how we can even end up injecting the version number we defined into the dataset itself so that it's fully visible at any point anyone interacts with the dataset. And it also means that anyone involved with a project, can talk about it in the same language, right? A business stakeholder can refer to something with a version number, a document writer, a project leader, developer. It just sort of avoids lots of ambiguity. Deployment environments we've already looked at, and CI/CD pipeline, that's pretty much where all the automation comes from, right? And it helps enormously in terms of enforcing the process as well. I'm not going to go too much into this. Just in the interest of time, I'm just going to point out a few more resources which are here without actually going into too much detail. So first of all, the preferred method of authentication is service principal. There's a whole page dedicated to how you actually set them up, and particularly which permissions are required within a Power BI workspace. So you've got that here for reference. Secondly, when it comes to GitHub, which I'm using as an example here, but just to be clear, this model works with any DevOps system, right? So it could easily, in the very same way, work with Azure DevOps or GitLab, for instance. Secrets need to be set so that we can keep them out of source control, right? And GitHub and all the other systems support that very nicely. So here is just a small reference. Without our YAML file, we can then refer to a secret that's been set at the repo level, for instance, in this particular way. It's useful to protect branches, to, for instance, say, in order to ensure that main, for instance, always is production and nothing other than a production. If we put a branch protection rule in place, we can ensure that no one is even able to accidentally or intentionally push into that particular branch, right? And we enforce that pull requests are always needed. So that's that. And then down here, I'm basically providing a bunch of examples with respect to what different types of triggers are supported. Again, that works across different systems. We just have different syntaxes everywhere. GitHub happens to have the cleanest and simplest syntax for most DevOps pieces. So here, as an example, I said earlier a development release, a development deployment is triggered whenever a pull request into the release branch is opened or modified. And this is basically what makes that happen, right? Very simple. We're saying on, to say that this is a trigger, we're saying on pull request on any branches that match this particular pattern. There are a few other examples as well. So let me answer the question we had earlier in terms of, well, how do I actually get my project into this particular format? So I'm going to switch across to VS Code. Here we go. The repo we looked at earlier is the one I've actually checked out here. And in fact, I've literally just checked it out from GitHub. You can see I don't even have a PBIX or PBIT file here, right? So let me show that first. Basically, as a developer, I want to either start some new work, or I want to continue on someone else's branch. So the first thing I have to do is to actually use PBI tools in order to create a PBIX file. And at this point, PBI tools is only available as a command line tool. I'm very keen to provide a graphical interface for it. Just don't have infinite time, unfortunately, and I'm much more focused on actually completing the DevOps story at this point. So what we need to do is PBI tools compile. Compile is the command which allows us to go from source control back into a PBIX or PBIT. Then I'm referencing the folder I want to compile from. So in this case, Contoso sales. And because that's a data set and not a report, I cannot produce a PBIX file. That is only supported for thin reports. Since it's a data set, it's got to be a PBIT file, and I need to specify that explicitly. It's just going to take a couple of seconds now. Then I've got my PBIT file, which I can open Power BI Desktop. There we go. And I'm just going to launch Power BI Desktop. Because it's a PBIT file, it means that it needs to refresh all the data. That's not going to take very long here because obviously I've got a very simple data model, but in practice, that is something you need to think about. You don't, if you had data sets that took 2 hours or so to do a complete refresh, that's probably not very practical for your developers. So what we normally do is we actually put parameters in place which enable certain data filters, either row filters or date filters, to ensure that a developer, if they have to do a full refresh, don't have to load a huge amount of data and can do that relatively quickly. So data set, so cool. If I switch to PBIT, I can see that's the file I just generated. And the data source in this case is publicly available. I don't even need to provide credentials here because it's all coming from a public GitHub repo. And in just a few seconds, I should have a fully fledged model in place with all the data loaded. There we go. Don't need another GitHub outage today. So here we go. I've got my model. As you can see, right, this is, I even have report pages here. And if I switch across, we can see there's data, right? So we've got that. Let's make sure we save it. And here we go. Contoso sales, save. Cool. Wanted me to specify the extension. There we go. Right, we got that. All right, so let's say I want to make, let's say I'm making some changes now, and I want to push those back into my repo. There are two ways of doing that. You can either do it offline once you've made all your changes. So basically, once the file is closed again, you can extract the sources when it's no longer open in Power BI Desktop. The more interesting way of achieving it is to use the PBI Tools watch mode. So if I run PBI Tools info, it's going to give me a listing of all my currently open Power BI sessions, specifically this one here. We can see that's the one I've got open at the moment. And what I'm interested in is this process ID. So 4112. So what I can do now is I can say PBI Tools extract. That's the opposite of compile. Extract means I've got a PBIX and I want to have source control, sources out of it. And then I do process ID 4112, and I do dash watch. And what's now happening is PBI Tools runs in the background, and it will kick off extracting changes whenever I click save in Power BI Power BI Desktop. So if I make this a little smaller, and then go in here and just make even a very trivial change, right? So let me just move this visual, right? If I now click save, and you take a look here, there, see, this is Power BI, PBI Tools kicking off. Because that model is already in source control, right? I can take advantage of the diff view I'm getting from VS Code in this case to see precisely what's actually changed. And so if I go down here, we can see there's a visual container. And look at this. We can see the X and Y coordinates for that container have changed, which is precisely what I did, right? I moved it to a different position on my page. That's actually replicated here. Unfortunately, position is captured in two different places. And then all the other changes are basically irrelevant. Power BI Desktop is quite chatty when it comes to creating those custom annotations. So sometimes they get emitted, sometimes they don't. This is stuff you need to get a feeling for. After a while, you know that you can ignore those kinds of changes. But so yeah, so this is what a report change looks like. If I do a model change, same thing. Let me do one thing we haven't accounted for yet. So remember the info table we looked at earlier? I don't think I've actually exposed all the possible values as a measure yet. So we've got version here, and I've got version char, run ID, oh no, we do. Sorry. I thought not all of them were in place. So that's cool, but let me just do, well, I'm just going to do a very silly change just for the demo, right? So just adding a line break in here into the margin measure. There we go. I've saved it, and no, I haven't saved it. I just confirmed it. So if I now save, we should expect that the DAX file corresponding to the margin measure actually shows us this additional line break in it. And that would be called margin.dax. There we go. That's precisely what happened, right? So this is pretty much source control at its best, in the sense that I can, in a very granular way, trace all the changes which happen, between two different versions of my data set or my report, and this is how it's reflected when you look at it locally. If I were to push that into GitHub, obviously the same change would show. So if I, just to wrap things up before we take a few more questions potentially, if I just go back here, yes. So coming back to what's already in GitHub for this particular data set, I already have an open pull request, right? So basically, sorry, not project, issues. So if I go to milestones, I've got a 1.1 release milestone created. So that one contains two issues, number formatting, and then also adding an additional measure. So that's basically my scope for the 1.1 release. And we can see that one of the issues already has a pull request linked to it. And this is what I was talking about earlier in terms of where all the communication and the conversation is going to happen. Because that's a very rich interface. So for instance, here I can see the various deployments as well as commits which happened with respect to that pull request. I can see the commits listed very explicitly here. I can also see any CI/CD runs that already took place. And most importantly, I can see which files have changed, right? So as a project lead, this is where I would normally go to start with, to actually see, if someone's created this pull request, I'm going in here and I'm looking, well, what have they changed? Is that in line with what I'm looking for, right? This one basically has everything we're looking for. So basically, we had number formats in place with 2 decimals, which I wanted to change. I wanted to actually not show any decimals anymore. So this is what's happened here. If I now go and merge the pull request, I can see I can do so because there's nothing preventing me from doing it. What's happening is that this is now going into my release branch, which will then automatically trigger a UAT deployment. And I can see that here. There we go. So on my landing page, this is the one which would have been kicked off by that particular change now. If I click on it, I can see there was a deployment 14 days ago, and then now, half a minute ago, a new deployment was kicked off, and I can actually see that happening in real time. The PBI tools deployment step is just running, and we're done, right? So that's all completed, and this particular change is now in my UAT workspace. I can see that here very nicely. Yeah, we don't have a lot of time left right now. I don't want to overrun. Do we have any more questions?
Yes, we actually have a couple of questions.
Nice.
So first off, is there a possibility to collect the metadata of multiple main branches, as in multiple Power BI reports / projects, centrally, to have some kind of development dashboard or overview? And I suspect that GitHub would have something in that area, not.
I was actually thinking about something like that as well recently. So my thinking was to use the execute DAX query API that Power BI offers, as long as you ensure that every single one of your data sets as an example, follow the same convention of actually having that metadata info table. And as long as you ensure that that table always exposes the exact same measures, which I think makes a lot of sense because you're always looking at run ID and branch and whatnot. You can basically use the API to then identify those data sets, run a set query against them to basically fetch things like version, environment, branch, and then expose that on a dashboard, right? So that's what I'm keen on doing internally. I don't think. Well, I mean, I might be wrong here, but I don't think GitHub has anything to offer where you basically aggregate across different projects.
Okay. I was asking because we are using Azure DevOps, and we actually inject a version number into our model, and we query that to actually verify that all of our clients are on the same edition. So we have implemented that functionality just using PowerShell.
Very nice. Maybe you should have a chat.
Yeah. Yeah. So next question. How do you bind a report to a data set through deployment in the manifest file?
Yes, that's really weird because that question comes all the time. Originally, I didn't think that was such a big deal, but it looks like lots of people are interested in that. It's in the pipeline for PPI tools right now. There's actually an open issue tracking that. And to be honest with you, it's relatively easy to implement. So basically, if I go here, that's a repository containing thin reports. The only thing you need to do is to basically go to the connections file and then replace the dataset ID here and here with a different one you want to bind to. So yeah, it's already clear how to do it. Obviously, it's not officially supported, but it fully works, and that's coming in one of the next PPI tools releases.
Yeah. And speaking of the future, how likely do you think it is that your fabulous tool will get superseded? Is this likely?
Given that I know what I know, which I can't talk about, it's a no. It's not very likely.
Great. And the final one, before I make my question,
sure.
have you leveraged this format, splitting PBI into components, to create modular components which can be directly imported into different projects? And this is where you need to have very tight and deep knowledge about the data sets.
Yes. Yeah. I'm still working on fundamentals, as you can see, right? So, for instance, with respect to DevOps automation, there are at least 2 or 3 dozen issues which I'd like to close. So this is the sort of stuff which is definitely possible in theory, but either we find some additional contributors, building some tooling on top of PPI tools, or I have to find time in at some point in the future. But yeah, I mean, I would be super keen if more people were actively engaged in actually, working on features like that.
Okay, so there's one more question coming in before I do mine. What about merging changes on visuals?
Yes. So obviously, when it comes to source control, merging and merge conflicts is one of the kind of scariest topics. It's actually useful that we're in here. So as I mentioned before, the key principle in terms of how PPI tools extracts a PPIX file is to facilitate good change tracking and good source control, right? And so that's why, as you can see here, the format you end up with is actually a lot of files with relatively little content in them, right? So lots of small files. So the structure of your report is represented in a folder structure, and that on its own helps enormously to with merge conflicts, because chances that developer A makes a change and then developer B makes a conflicting change are massively reduced here. As long as, right, and that's really important, as long as you coordinate and don't assign, tasks to two different people where you already know they're going to be, changing the same visual, right? So this is pretty much what the project lead needs to think stuff through a little bit.
Okay, so my question is that I made a survey with the people entering this meeting on how many years they've been actively engaged with Power BI, and maybe a lot of them are from business, or maybe a few of them, maybe the veterans are from the business, and maybe it's the first step into actually source control and that complete universe. What would be the first step that you would recommend? What would be the first thing to implement after you have your GitHub repo up and running? What would be the first thing to focus on getting up and running?
Well, assuming you've got to the point where you've actually extracted your sources, right, using PBI tools extract. So we looked at that earlier. One of the pieces I haven't demoed yet, and I think that is the right answer here, is PBI tools deployment manifests, right? So basically, unlike traditional approaches where CI/CD pipelines are configured in a UI and sort of for every single project individually with lots of manual bits and pieces, PBI tools deployments are all source controlled as well. In fact, this JSON file we're looking at right now basically defines the full logic, and what we're doing in Azure, in GitHub, as an example, is literally just invoking it, right? So the deployment is basically just this one line here. We're calling PBI tools deploy, and that's it, right? So GitHub is just invoking things here. There's no logic in that. So, and what that means is that we don't rely on a DevOps remote tool at all to actually run the deployment. So what I've got here, I can run completely end-to-end on my own. In fact, I've done this earlier today. So for instance, I can run this command, PBI tools deploy. Dot is a folder reference, that's the current folder. Reports references this particular definition. Production references an environment. And what if says, I'm not quite sure yet, don't actually push anything to Power BI, but do everything else. Basically check that my credentials and everything else works as expected. And that means you can, so you don't even have to put CI/CD into the picture here to actually get some benefits, as long as you've got the authentication in place. And I showed earlier how that's already documented on pbi.tools. So what I've done, PBI client secret is an environment variable I've set up just on my machine. And because of that, I can use it. If I take the what if away and run the same thing, it's actually taking what's currently in that folder, and it's deploying it into production. As you can see, that only took a few seconds because it's a thin report. It's super fast. So that's what I would recommend. Again, there are plenty of public examples out there in terms of public GitHub repos and also Azure DevOps repos where you can find a starting point. And I've done at least 3 or 4 recordings already where I'm actually going more into the details here. So yeah, that would be the answer. Try that. And then worry about CI/CD and how to actually bring it all into Azure or GitHub or so.
Okay. So I see one participant having raised a hand. If it's okay with you, we can take this last one.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Lau, please unmute if you want.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
So is it correct that you can only like deploy tiny reports from the tool?
What is a tiny report? I mean,
you just said that those two reports that you just deployed, they were very fast, right? So
well, we need to distinguish between data sets on the one hand and thin reports on the other hand. So thin reports meaning they don't have a data set embedded, they just have a connection to an already existing data set, right? When it comes to thin reports, they're generally super fast, even when we've got dozens or hundreds of pages. So in that respect, it doesn't have to be tiny.
Right. So are you able to deploy the dataset from this tool?
So for data sets, the approach that PBI Tools is taking is to actually use XML endpoints, which basically makes it premium only for data sets, right? So if you wanted to deploy a data set into Power BI Pro, you'd have to provide a fully hydrated PBIX file. So basically a binary file which has the data in it already. And that pretty much goes, against, the whole idea of source control. So that's currently not supported, just to be very clear here, right? As a pro user, you definitely have limitations, but Microsoft intentionally is not providing those kinds of APIs for pro users. So just to summarize, theoretically, yes, you could put a PBIX file with a data set into a repo and then have PBI tools deployed. That's possible, but you lose all the benefits of change tracking and everything else that you get from source control, because it would then have to be that big binary file.
Thank you.
All right, with that, I will post a link in the chat if you want to contribute to Matthias's great work. Just see if I got that right. Then it's actually possible to become a sponsor of the GitHub project.
Indeed.
And that's a very small way of chipping in, so to speak. If you are not in for the code yourself, you can at least assist with a small donation on the side, which will bring a lot of value to us as Power BI developers. I want to thank you, Matthias, for joining us today and showing us what this fabulous tool can do. And for myself, I'm really keen to get going and get to know this tool a lot better. So thank you.
Fantastic.
And thank you for attending.
Thanks very much. Really appreciate you inviting me and giving the opportunity. And sorry for running over 10 minutes.
Yeah, no worries, no worries. I will stop the recording.